Yo, what's up? Nefer is looking to be finalized from version 4 beta and probably won't receive any more changes, so today I'm going to go over how to build and use Nefer inside of patch Luna 2. So, Nefer is an on-field DPS dendro catalyst character who specializes in dealing Lunar-Bloom charge attack damage. She has a base 200 elemental mastery similar to Lauma and enables the ability to create Lunar-Bloom or Verdant Dew for the team. She has a relatively high 344 base attack stat, but this doesn't necessarily have as much relevance considering a lot of her scaling is based off her elemental mastery. And like most other main DPSs, she has a crit damage ascension, giving you 38.4 crit damage. So in patch 6.1, we are going to be getting a brand new boss called the Frost Knight Heras, and this will be the boss ascension mat Nefer needs in order to get her to level 90. But on the bright side, Nefer does have some materials that you can pre-farm for her right now before 6.1 drops in order to get her as maxed out on day 1 as you possibly can. Okay, starting off, we can look at the Fatui warrants released in patch 6.0. These are dropped by the Fatui Opraniki. Then you're going to need 36 gray, 96 green, and then 129 blue of the warrants in order for her to be triple crowned. But later on in the video, I'm going to go over talent priority, and I'm not going to recommend you to level her normal attack. So in reality, it's just 30 grays, 74 green, and then 96 blue. Okay, finally taking a look at her talent books, she's going to take the Elysium books introduced in 6.0. And then in order to triple crown her, you're going to need 9 teachings of Elysium, you're going to need 63 guide to Elysium, and then 114 philosophies of Elysium. But like I said earlier, I don't recommend you leveling her normal attack, so in reality it's going to be 6 teachings, 42 guides, and then 76 philosophies. Also, you're going to need for past level 6, the Ascended Sample Rook. This is dropped from the Game Before the Gate challenge reward introduced in the latter half of Natlan, and you'll need 18 to triple crown and then 12 to double crown like I recommend. You're also going to need the Moonfall Silver. You're going to need 168 of these. These are the same material that Lauma uses, and some of these are Conquest locked, so make sure you get caught up on that. And before we get into the next part, a quick word from our sponsor.
Are you tired of painstakingly farming for Primo Gems? Want to make sure you have enough to guarantee that next 5-star character or weapon? Level up your savings with LootBar. Whether you're topping up your Genesis crystals for the new Luna 1 reset or grabbing a Blessing of the Welcome Moon, LootBar has you covered with incredible discounts on not just Genshin Impact, but a variety of other games. Don't miss out on these deals. Use my link in the description to get started and give your gaming wallet a major break today.
So, taking a look at Nefer's kit, we're going to go ahead and start off with the Senate Strategy Dance of 1,000 Nights. This is her elemental skill, a dance that dissolves dynasties, as chilling as a winter's night on the great sea of sand, yet lingering with the tenderness of the moonlit gaze. Nefer charges forward, dealing AoE dendro damage and entering the Shadow Dance state. While in the Shadow Dance state, if you have at least one Verdant Dew, Nefer's charge attacks will be replaced with Special Charge Attack, Phantasm Performance, which will not consume stamina. When in the Shadow Dance state, Nefer's resistance to interruption is increased. So this is where most of Nefer's damage comes from when you are on-fielding her, using 2 of these elemental skills in rotation, and then doing 3 separate charge attacks per elemental skill, and then most of this damage is counted as Lunar-Bloom damage with the coordinated attacks from your clones. So each use of this elemental skill has a 9-second duration alongside a 9-second cooldown, and you can hold 2 of them, kind of like how Zhao's skill works or Navia's skill works. Another thing to mention is that in her Ascension 1 passive, whenever you do use your elemental skill, it'll convert any nearby bloom cores into Seeds of Deceit, and then Seeds of Deceit are used by your charge attack in order to increase the damage of the charge attacks and then giving Nefer an additional 100 elemental mastery. So speaking of elemental mastery, a lot of the multipliers inside of her main damage sources come strictly from the elemental mastery stat, meaning building attack percent or any of the other stats might not necessarily be as valuable as building directly into elemental mastery. I'll go on in the later portion of this video telling you what main stats to use for each piece, but as an idea you can kind of get right now, majority of the damage comes from elemental mastery and crit stats. Getting into the elemental burst, Sacred Vow, True Eyes Phantasm, grant revelation to the mysteries of false through Thoth's truth sight, dealing AoE dendro damage to opponents ahead. When unleashed, Nefer will consume all Veils of Falsehood to increase the damage dealt by the current elemental burst. So the Veils of Falsehood kind of ties back into the Ascension 1 passive I was talking about earlier with the Seeds of Deceit. Every time you do consume a Seed of Deceit, it gives you a stack of Veil of Falsehood, and that's what increases your charge attack damage. So by using your elemental burst, you'll consume your charge attack stacking bonus multiplier in order to give the elemental burst and increased damage multiplier. The thing is that it's never really worth using this, as it's technically just a damage bonus multiplier, and the elemental burst duration actually increases the rotation length. So later on in the video, when I'm going over the combos and rotations, I'll explain why this has less value. TLDR is that this burst has a long animation, increasing rotation times, and it doesn't deal direct Lunar-Bloom damage, making it have a little bit less value. Okay, let's go over the Ascension passives. A Wager of Moonlight. Nefer will be granted the corresponding buff effects based on the party's moon sign level. Moon sign Ascending Gleam. When she unleashes her elemental skill, Sinich Strategy Dance of 1,000 Suns, any dendro cores and bountiful cores on the field will be converted to Seeds of Deceit, and any Lunar-Bloom reactions triggered by nearby characters in the last 15 seconds that would create dendro cores or bountiful cores will instead create Seeds of Deceit. Seeds of Deceit cannot trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon reactions and will not burst. When Nefer unleashes Charge Attack or Phantasm Performance, she can absorb Seeds of Deceit within a certain range, and gaining 1 stack of Veil of Falsehood for every seed absorbed. When this effect gains 3 stacks, or when the 3rd stack's duration is refreshed, Nefer's Elemental Mastery will be increased by 100 for 8 seconds. What you really need to know is that if you have 2 non-cry characters in the team, whenever Nefer uses an elemental skill, it will convert all bloom cores on the field into Seeds of Deceit, and this only triggers after using her elemental skill. Then once you've created 3 Seeds of Deceit, you get a Charge Attack and Elemental Mastery buff. Alright, taking a look at her next passive, Daughter of the Dust and Sand. While Nefer is in the Shadow Dance state, if she enters the Slither state within 5 seconds of a party member triggering a Lunar-Bloom reaction, she will continuously regenerate Verdant Dew. Every 100 points of Nefer's Elemental Mastery beyond 500 will strengthen this effect's regeneration by 10%, up to a maximum of 50%. The wording here is a bit strange because inside of her normal attack's description, it says that she enters the slithering state by holding her elemental skill, but it also says that she should enter it by just using the charge attack from Phantasm Performance. This passive essentially increases the rate that Verdant Dew will be generated by up to 50%. This essentially lets Nefer use her charge attacks more consistently while she's inside her elemental skill state because of the increased Verdant Dew generation. This matters a lot inside of her first rotations when she doesn't have any Verdant Dew pre-stacked, and it could help subsequent rotations by allowing Lauma to potentially use hold skill and increasing the amount of Verdant Dews you would have starting off for Nefer's second rotation. And then finally, looking at her last passive, Moon Sign Benediction Dusklit Eves. When a party member triggers a bloom reaction, it will be converted into the Lunar-Bloom reaction with every point of elemental mastery that Nefer has, increasing Lunar-Bloom space damage by 0.0175% up to a maximum of 14%. This will also increase her Moon Sign level by 1 when she's in the party. This is essentially the same passive that Lauma has, and they do stack, meaning instead of getting a 14% damage increase to Lunar-Bloom, it's a 28%, which actually is somewhat significant. And just in case you didn't know what Verdant Dew or Lunar-Bloom does, Verdant Dew is created by making a dendro core, just a normal dendro core with Lauma or Nefer in the team, and then that dendro core will create a Verdant Dew, and then the Verdant Dew can essentially be used as a currency for Lauma or Nefer. Okay, now that we finally explained her kit, just a quick mention to the normal attacks because you're not going to really want to use them. They are essentially just there to fill in downtime if you are missing Verdant Dew, but in the optimal rotations, you are not going to want to use them. So, speaking of optimal rotations, let's go into that. Okay, so I'm going to assume Nefer, Lauma, Aino, and Nahida. So, first off, what you're going to want to do is use Aino's elemental skill to apply Hydro, then use Nahida's elemental skill into Elemental Burst. After that, you want to go back into Aino to use her Elemental Burst. This is to reapply Hydro and continue generating Verdant Dew throughout the other character's field time. Then go into Lauma, use her Q into her Elemental skill. Make sure you use the tap version to not consume the Verdant Dew. Then finally on field with Nefer by using your Elemental skill and then using 3 charge attacks. Then once your 3 charge attacks are over, use your Elemental skill again into another 3 charge attacks. From here, you have 2 different options. 1, use your Elemental Burst if the enemy is low HP to finish them off, or B, start your rotation over again and swap back into Aino and cast her Elemental skill and repeat the rotation. Okay, so now that we've gone over how to play her and how she kind of works, let's go over the artifact priorities. The first thing that we really should talk about is the main stat pieces for each individual piece. Because she has a bit of a weird playstyle and a weird kit, it does technically differentiate between your substat investment. So First off, for the timepiece and the goblet, you are going to always want to run Elemental Mastery with crit stats in the substats. Everything else kind of doesn't matter. She doesn't care about ER, she doesn't care about attack percent, she doesn't really care about the other stats. And then for the circlet is a toss-up between if you have a very strong EM circlet with good crit substats or a crit circlet with EM substats. Typically, you should be running a crit circlet with EM substats, but in some situations, if you do have a high enough CV on your build, you can get away with running an EM circlet. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the 4-piece artifact sets that Nefer can run. So, the best in slot, undeniably for Nefer, will be the Knights of Sky Unveiling, the 6.0 artifact set released in Not Cry. This set was tailor-made for DPSs from Not Cry, providing a 80 EM from the 2-piece, and then a 30 crit rate buff if you are using 2 Not Cry characters, alongside damage bonus increase to the Lunar-Bloom reaction itself. This is definitively her best in slot, as it was tailor-made for her and Flynn's, so this is the set that you do want to prioritize for Nefer. Next, let's talk about Deepwood Memories. So you can use Deepwood Memories on Nefer, but I would recommend that you do use this on someone else, such as Lauma or Nahida, or even Aino, depending on the situation. This set provides a 30% pretty much permanently active shred for Dendro itself, and it is a very strong support set for Nefer, and it allows you to run Knights of Sky Unveiling on Nefer, while you still get the shred if you run it on someone else. Okay, let's talk about Silken Mood Serenade. So, Silken Mood Serenade should probably always have a slot on at least one of your teammates inside of Nefer's team. That's because you're going to typically be running her alongside 2 non-cry characters, or alongside 1, but she counts for it, so you're going to have 2 basically. But the point being is that this is going to be an unconditional 120 elemental mastery for your team, which Nefer really wants. So, this set should be particularly used on someone on your team that has energy requirements such as Aino or Lauma, and this set will also increase the Lunar-Bloom damage dealt by Nefer herself because of one of the passives as well. So I wouldn't recommend you run this set on Nefer, but I would recommend that you always run this set on at least one character inside of your Nefer's team. Okay, and then the final artifact set that I want to mention, the actual GOAT of Genshin Impact, 4-piece Instructor. So for this set specifically, I would recommend you run it on someone triggering the reactions. So like in the aforementioned combo section earlier, using the same team of Lauma, Nefer, Aino, and Nahida, you could put this Instructor set on Aino, since she's going to be the one constantly triggering the Bloom reaction, because there's always going to be a dendro aura on the enemy. She'll be triggering the Instructors basically 24/7, giving you an additional 120 elemental mastery. And since Aino's personal damage doesn't really matter anyway, you're not losing anything by giving her less personal damage, but giving her a complete buffing set. Okay, finally going into the talent priority. I'm going to make this quick since there's not really much to mention, but majority of Nefer's personal damage is coming from the elemental skill and the elemental skill's charge attack multiplier. You can basically just ignore the normal attack, and then the elemental burst is a secondary priority, but it does not deal a contributional amount of damage, so you can ignore it if you really want to. Okay, let's talk about Nefer's weapon options. But before we do that, we need to mention how her weapons contribute and interact with the team and personal damage that she does. So I think a great example to showcase what I want to contribute here is how Flynn's and Ineffa works versus Nefer and Lauma. Because Flynn's does around 60 to 70% of his team's damage, while Ineffa deals the other 30%, you can take a look and see that if we have a weapon that increases Flynn's personal damage by roughly 30%, it doesn't necessarily increase the team damage by 30%. But if we take a look at Nefer deals 90-ish% of her team's DPS. So increasing Nefer's DPS by 25% can result in a team DPS increase of around 25%. So just keep that in mind as we go over these weapon options. Okay, getting started, let's talk about the Reliquary of Truth, Nefer's personal weapon coming out alongside her in 6.1. This is a 27% personal DPS increase over the Black Marrow Lantern at R5. It is a very strong signature weapon. It doesn't really have much competition except for R5 Widsith if you do get the EM buff, but later on we'll talk about Widsith. But for now, you need to know is that 27% personal DPS increase, 25.7 or 26% team DPS increase. So very strong weapon. And this is kind of a result of Nefer dealing a lot of her personal damage, how the team DPS is increasing relatively similar to the personal DPS. Okay, let's talk about the Black Marrow Lantern. This is the weapon that I suggest the free-to-play players or people that don't want to get the signature weapon use. This weapon is the new non-cry craftable weapon that you were able to access in 6.0. this is a very strong weapon. It gives you a 220.5 elemental mastery buff on its secondary passive, alongside a 48% Lunar-Bloom damage bonus. Specifically for Nefer, this is very strong, considering that there isn't really a lot of ways to obtain Lunar-Bloom damage bonus, making this the best free-to-play option that you can get. Another thing to mention is that R1 is only 4% worse than R5, so don't stress too much if you can't get it to R5 instantly. It is not that big of an increase. So next, let's talk about the Dawning Frost. This was originally called the Frost Star in my previous videos, but as of recent beta changes, it's now called Dawning Frost. So Dawning Frost at R1 is around 1.8% better than Black Marrow at R5. Before, in my previous calcs, I had it a little bit worse, but I've done a bit more optimizations, and a lot of the EM has caused diminishing returns, so it is a little bit better than the Black Marrow Lantern now. So this weapon is fairly strong, but I think the main caveat of this weapon is that it's going to be paired alongside Nefer's signature on the weapon banner. The problem with this is that if you are already pulling on the weapon banner, you should be pulling and having a guaranteed enough to get the signature weapon and not to just get a Dawning Frost copy. So this weapon is a bit hard to recommend, but if you do have it and you lose your 50-50 on the signature and you don't want to keep going, you can use this instead of the free-to-play option. At R5, it is around 10% better than Black Marrow Lantern at R5, so keep that in mind that it's definitely a solid increase and definitely something you should consider. Okay, let's talk about Aetherlight Spindaloot. This was the 6.0 event weapon. Typically, you're going to want to run this on Lauma, but I just wanted to include this here because if you do want to use her burst playstyle, there is some possibilities for it to be semi-decent. So it's 90% of the Black Marrow Lantern. It's definitely not bad, but I wouldn't recommend this over it. So I just wanted to include this in case you didn't have the Black Marrow Lantern and you still are building it, but you do have the Aetherlight Spindaloot from the event. So next, let's talk about the Widsith. So I have a few different Widsith calcs here. First is Widsith R1 true and then Widsith R5 true. So how I calculated this is I added a damage percent, attack percent, an EM buff, and then 3 no buffs to count as 6 rotations worth of damage. Then I divided it all by 6 to spit out a number that should be relatively digestible for the average damage off of a single rotation. This is essentially a long form content type of DPS calculation. So in one rotation content, this can change. Looking at its percentage below R5 Black Marrow Lantern, it's definitely not that far off. I can show you that my R5 Widsith is literally at 99.968% of the Black Marrow Lantern at R5, so definitely can use it. Okay, let's talk about the fake EM buffs, the kind of one rotation stuff that you would use in Spiral Abyss. The Widsith EM buff is around 10% better than the baseline Black Marrow at R5. Then if you have Widsith at R5, it's around 28% better, so even better than the signature weapon. But the caveat is that this is a 1 in 3 chance, and it's only for one rotation, meaning after your first rotation, you'll have downtime, then it'll just half out the DPS. So you have to kill stuff in one rotation in order to get close to this number. Okay, I want to mention Lauma's signature weapon because it is something you can use if you don't have Nefer's signature weapon, but I kind of didn't really do any calcs for it, considering that if you do have Lauma's signature weapon, you should be using it on Lauma instead. So that's something I just wanted to mention, that it should be around a little bit worse than her signature, but it's better than the free-to-play options, and it should be better than the Frost Star or the Dawning Frost. So keep that in mind, you can use that. Okay, let's start talking about Nefer's teams and subsequent teammates that you can use. So I'm going to format this section talking specifically about certain teammates and then certain comps that they can fit in and how they work. Nefer's teams really don't have that much diversity because you're always going to want to pair her with Lauma, and then you're always going to have to pair her with a Hydro character in order to activate the Seeds of Deceit in order to get the Charge Attack Ascension 1 buff. So 2 slots are already filled, meaning the last slot is the majority of the time what you are going to be confused about or wanting to replace. Okay, so let's talk about the first teammate, the elephant in the room, Lauma. So I want to preface Lauma's section by telling you the actual truth. Lauma is the most reliant character for Nefer. This is more reliant than Flynn's and Ineffa, or Skirk and Escoffier. Nefer depends on Lauma really hard. So if you don't have Lauma, I really want you to consider if you do want to get Nefer, but it's not necessarily that she's completely awful without her. So I'm going to go over some teams and some calcs that I have on Lauma-less Nefer stuff to show you what the strength would be. But first, let's talk about what Lauma actually does for Nefer. Looking at Lauma's kit, you can see her elemental burst, Runo, all hearts become the beating moon. This will increase the Lunar-Bloom damage by 400% of Lauma's elemental mastery, and there is a trigger quota of 18 stacks, which you can actually fully consume with 6 charge attacks inside of both of her elemental skills durations, which is the amount you use. So this is basically a flat damage increase of 400% of Lauma's EM, which already itself is an insane increase. Then let's go ahead and look at some of Lauma's ascensions. So Light for the Frosty Night. When you are in the Ascending Gleam state, all nearby party members' Lunar-Bloom damage, crit rate, and crit damage is increased by 20%. So this basically eases up the artifact building for your Nefer. And then another thing she does is her moon sign benedictions. When a bloom is triggered, it is converted to Lunar-Bloom, and then every point of Lauma's elemental mastery increases the Lunar-Bloom space damage up to 14%. So this stacks alongside Nefer's exact same passive, so you get a 28% all Lunar-Bloom damage dealt increase, which is fairly strong. Another thing to mention is Lauma's Dendro Res Shred. So Lauma at talent level 10 will provide 25% Dendro and Hydro Res Shred, which is really solid considering a lot of this team doesn't really have a lot of Dendro Shred outside of the Deepwood Memories artifact set. Okay, taking a look at my master sheet here, we have Lauma, Nefer, Aino, and Nahida. I just want to show you some differences between not having Lauma and having her because it is a pretty major decrease. Here you can see my Nefer, Lauma, Aino, Nahida team. I'm running Lauma on Ether Knight with SMS, and then I'm running Aino on Forest Regalia with Instructor, and Nahida with Prototech Amber and Deepwood Memories. So here you can see I'm getting around 98k team DPS, with 93k of that personal DPS belonging strictly to Nefer. And you can see these quills here, these are essentially the damage that Lauma is giving from her elemental burst, being around 277,000 damage of rotation. This is really strong. Another thing to point out is the elemental resistance shred that is being brought here is also increasing the damage by quite a lot as well. And if we were to alternate and take Lauma out of the team and replace her with someone like Ineffa, we could see the damage drops by around 30k. So you can see the damage here is very reliant on Lauma. This is like, as much as I want to say like it's a good option because she's a Dendro Catalyst and you can just run like Hyper Bloom, the damage drop off by not having Lauma is so fucking ridiculous. It's honestly like I can't recommend to pull Nefer if you don't have Lauma. Alright, now that we've talked about how evil Lauma is and how required she is, let's go ahead and start talking about some of the other teammates. So we're going to talk about Aino and specifically why you want to use her with Nefer. Well, why Aino is, the short answer is she sucks, but everyone else sucks more. So let's be honest, straight up, Aino isn't a good character. She barely gives any team buffs unless you've got her C1 or C6, and her personal damage is terrible. But that's actually why she works so well. The main reason you'd pick her for a Nefer team is because of her elemental burst. It has a super low cooldown and provides Hydro application with no requirements. That last part is huge because it means you don't have to stress about fitting those long, rigid rotations you need for characters like Xingqiu or Yelan with their long cooldown bursts. You can basically burst off cooldown and keep the Hydro application coming. Since her damage is so bad, you can actually use it to her advantage. You can completely skip traditional damage dealing artifact sets and just focus her completely on support. You can literally get away with running 4-star instructor set and running a 5-star ER timepiece because the only thing you care about is using her elemental burst. Now, because you're running her in a Dendro team, you can equip her with the craftable weapon, Forest Regalia. This gives her 2 benefits. 1, an EM buffing artifact set instructor, and 2, an EM buffing weapon, Forest Regalia. And the Forest Regalia will also give her energy recharge to help with her ER requirements since she's running a 4-star set. But you really don't even need to build her. The crazy part is you can run a level 1 Aino with 111 talents and Forest Regalia with the instructor set, and it'll basically perform the same as running a level 90 with 10-10-10 talents Aino. So don't stress too much about investing materials into her, just get the right gear and you'll be alright. Bottom line, Aino isn't good, but she's unironically the best option right now because every other Hydro support sucks when paired with Nefer. She fills the Hydro slot better than anyone else does currently. I fully expect this to change when Kolobina comes out. She'll probably be the new premium Hydro support, and Aino will eventually fall off, but until that day, Aino is the character for this team. So let's talk about Nahida. She's taking the last slot primarily because she gives a massive 250 elemental mastery boost from her elemental burst. Since Nefer scales heavily with elemental mastery, this is a huge damage increase, roughly 15% for the team, making Nahida a great choice. Since the Hydro and Lauma are fixed in their slots, the final slot needs to offer some form of utility. Because we're running triple dendro, Nahida's energy needs are minimal, allowing her to burst every rotation. This means that we can use the prototype Amber on her. By doing this, her burst not just turns from an EM buff, but the ability to trigger prototype Amber's healing effect, transforming her from a potent buffer to a semi-healer. Nahida is the top recommendation in my opinion for this role right now. While future Nodcry units might offer some competition, she fits the best if you do have her currently. Okay, let's talk about Kuki Shinobu. So if you don't have Nahida, Kuki is very much so easily the baseline or default option for this team. She fills in a very few important roles. So, defensive utility. The team seriously lacks defensive options, and Kuki's elemental skill provides reliable, continuous healing for the active character. This immediately makes the team much safer and easier to play, so that's already a great bonus. Next is her Electro application. The constant Electro application is crucial because it allows both Nefer and Lauma to trigger spread reactions during their damage windows. While it can vary, you can typically count on around 4 spreads per rotation. This is a significant damage increase just off that alone because of Nefer's EM scaling. This buff is very strong. Then her Elemental Mastery buffing. Just like we talked about with Aino, giving EM to Nefer is huge. You can run Kuki with Sapwood Blade to give an additional EM buff to the active character, which makes Nefer even better. Overall, Kuki is a fantastic all-rounder, and she brings much needed healing and enables extra damage reactions and boosts Nefer's personal damage, making her an easy recommendation for this flex slot. Okay, let's move on to Yelan. She originally was our baseline option in earlier videos when we were unsure about the consistency of Verdant to uptime, but with all the new information we have now, I would lean towards not recommending her specifically for this team. Yelan brings a couple of things besides her personal damage. Her damage percent buff, this is a huge part of her support value, but unfortunately Nefer's damage source can't actually benefit from it. This is a massive hit to Yelan's utility as a support in this lineup. Then, the restricted burst condition. To get Yelan's crucial off-field Hydro application, you need to use normal attacks. The problem is that this drastically increases Nefer's on-field time, which lengthens the entire team's rotation, ultimately lowering your overall team's DPS. Since Nefer functions as a hyper carry style character, the goal is really to maximize her damage through buffs rather than focus on secondary damage dealers like Yelan. When you realize Yelan's main damage buff doesn't work, and her burst mechanic actively drags down the rotation time, the anti-synergy becomes clear. While Yelan can technically work, she's definitely not recommended over options like Aino or the other dedicated Hydro character we'll talk about next. So let's talk about Furina. This section gets a little unconventional because her normal playstyles don't quite fit with this team. Usually you'd build Furina for either personal damage with a set like Golden Troop, or from buffing with her elemental bursts with also using Tenacity of the Millith. But here's the problem. Nefer doesn't benefit from Furina's damage bonus from her burst, which makes casting it a waste of field time, and the attack percent from a set like Tenacity doesn't really help Nefer either. So here's what we do. We can completely ignore the burst. Instead, we use Furina strictly as a Hydro applicator and a semi-sub DPS with just her elemental skill, and simply cast her skill and swap out every other rotation to maintain its uptime. By doing this, you can equip it with Sapwood Blade and the Instructor artifact set. This setup essentially turns your C0 Furina into a C0 Aino, but with a slight edge in the personal off-field DPS. The main challenge with this approach is the HP drain from her elemental skill. However, this is easily circumvented by using the defensive options we talked about before, like Kuki for healing, Nahida with prototype Amber, or Ineffa in the future with her shield. So while this is not her traditional role, this setup is a great way to utilize Furina's continuous Hydro application while also squeezing out a little bit of an EM buff, making her a strong contender for the Hydro role. Now, is this setup cope and low-key fucked up? Yes. Do you really want to use your Furina on an instructor set with Sapwood Blade to buff your Nefer who doesn't even use the personal damage bonus? Probably not. But if you want to be technical, this is something you could do. Anyway, Furina is a solid option, so don't feel bad using her. I wouldn't personally recommend Furina here considering the damage bonus buff is useless and she's extending rotation times when she could be serving a different team better in Stygian Onslaught or Spiral Abyss. But you can use her. You can do that cope troll setup where you run double instructor with fucking Sapwood. You could do that. Okay, let's talk about Xingqiu, because Xingqiu is really similar to Furina, kind of, in this case. So, typically, the best in slot set for Xingqiu will be either SMS or Instructor. His personal damage just isn't that great. And the main benefits here for using Xingqiu is his defensive utility from the damage reduction from his rain swords and from the healing that when his rain swords break, you do receive. Xingqiu can be ran in a similar way to Furina with the elemental skill every rotation, but instead this time you have to swap between your elemental skill and your elemental burst, so the ER Rex do make it a little bit more difficult to do. But it does work because it's a little bit of a mixture of both worlds where you get some defensive utility, but you also get some of the damage that Xingqiu would provide alongside the Hydro application and the EM buffing. So overall, he's an alright pick. Definitely not as good as probably like the Furina setup with this, but it works. So I've talked about mainly all of the Hydro off-field appliers, and you can kind of see the setups you use for them are super cope, right? You're going to be running Instructor Sapwood, Instructor Force Regalia, building full ER, not using your elemental burst. So you can kind of understand that the problem here sits inside of the niche of Nefer rather than in the characters themselves. So keep that in mind. I just wanted to point that out. It's not the characters being bad, it's fucking Nefer being an evil woman. Okay, let's talk about Nilou now. So Nilou, typically, like I said in my previous video, she's not really that great, but if you do have her C2, she actually might be a semi-competitive option if you run a double Hydro setup with like Aino, Furina, or something else, and then you run C2 Nilou. So totally usable option, but I wouldn't recommend unless C2. The conversion of the bloom cores and then the bloom cores not being able to be popped while you are using Nefer kind of makes anti-synergy, so keep that in mind. Okay, let's talk about Ineffa. This one is going to be a pretty long section because there's a lot of really niche stuff about Ineffa that I need to bring up. First off, Ineffa might be the best in slot teammate depending on when release happens if we get some more testing. So right now, looking at the teams, she provides a team EM buff overall, which we were talking about earlier is very strong for Nefer and even for Lauma. So that is already a great thing. Secondly, she's providing electro application very, very oftenly, meaning that you're going to be getting a lot of spreads. So for this team specifically, I was assuming 4 spreads, and that already is a very solid buff again, just like it was for Kuki. So another thing to mention is the lunar charged stuff. So specifically for this team, you really don't want to run Aino because the Hydro application is not enough. She doesn't provide that much Hydro application, like we talked about earlier, and she doesn't really have that long of a duration on her burst because of the low cooldown time. So getting away with something like Furina here with the Sapwood Blade and the Instructor setup we were just talking about might actually be better than what we were recommending before with Aino and Nahida. This has a lot of variance and nuance though, so don't take everything I'm saying here completely the truth. There is a grain of salt that you need to take. So just keep that in mind. This character is pretty strong, and when she does come out after some more testing, I'll be able to confirm whether this is the best team or not. Okay, let's talk about Baizhu. So previously in my previous video, I talked about Baizhu being an okay option, but he kind of has some anti-synergy considering you want to build him full HP in order to max out his passive that buffs Lunar-Bloom, but then he's a dendro character, so in reality, building EM would also be valuable. So it kind of makes this weird like push and pull type of thing, but after thinking about it more, I think you can kind of get away with just running some EM with HP substats and then trying to build as much EM as possible. The problem is though, is that you're not going to get as much value here as you normally would. The healing and the shielding is good, so I definitely would say that this is a good character option for teams that lack a sustain or people that prefer sustain. So don't feel bad using him, but some of the ways his kit works with Nefer and with Moonsign level specifically is anti-synergistic. Okay, talking about Kokomi. Kokomi is actually a very solid option. She might increase some rotation time, so you really don't want to use your elemental burst, but using her as an off-field E bot, and she's HP scaling, meaning she'll give you more of the non-card resonance passive. This is definitely a solid option, but I don't know how willing I would be to recommend over the buffing / defensive utility options rather than just her being a strictly healing option. Some earlier calcs in the beta, I was seeing some talk about Zhongli. Zhongli can work for the Dendro Shred, and he's giving Shred to Hydro as well, but personally, I don't think that there's a real reason to use him considering the alternatives to the defensive utility and the semi-buffing he does. You can run him on Instructor, but you can't run him on a Sumeru craftable weapon. Considering he is Geo, he will not be able to actually create a Dendro reaction, meaning you'll only be getting the Instructor buff. Then if you're getting the Instructor buff, the shield is going to be weakened itself, so there's already some problems there. Personally, I think he's an okay option. He's probably like more of a brain dead option if anything, but definitely not bad. Okay, this last 2 sections is kind of me just talking about some like cope free-to-play options. This one I'm talking about Diona. The only thing she provides is the 200 Elemental Mastery from C6. If you don't have C6, don't use Diona. That's it. Okay, talking about Barbara. So I saw some talk about Barbara and using her off-field hydro innate like surrounding aura, like when you walk up to enemies to proc the blooms, and then running her on the instructor set. This is an okay option. I don't know. I don't really think that this is really that great. I mean, I guess it works as some sort of defensive utility, but I feel like it's more of a free-to-play thing. I don't know. It's not my personal forte. I don't really recommend it. If you want to use some defensive utility, use the stuff we talked about earlier. So that's my recommendation for that. Okay, so this spreadsheet that I used, I will be linking in the description, so you can go ahead and download that, and then I will also be making a Google Sheet version. I'm not sure when I'll post that. I'll probably post that in the pinned comment. So if you do want that, go ahead and go to the description and save. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe. Also, if you do find anything wrong inside of it, I will update it. Just go ahead and reply to this video or make a comment. So I'll do that as well. So I'm gonna leave the constellation segment really short, just kind of gonna leave you with a screenshot, and you can see how much of the damage increases I've calculated for each of the things. So assuming C0R5 on the free-to-play weapon for Nefer, so this is exactly what I'm getting. Specifically, some things I want to mention is that C2 is a very, very strong constellation, and C5 doesn't really do anything at all because you're not going to use your elemental burst. Then C6 has a separate bonus multiplier, and it changes some of the ways that your elemental skill and your charge attack work. So that's just some stuff I wanted to mention. If you really want me to go in more detail, just reply about it in the comments, and I'll reply to you then. Okay, let's talk about investment priority. So would you rather get Lauma, C1, or R1? So basically, I think I've pretty much implied from my previous videos and from this video that Lauma is the highest priority that you should be grabbing. Make sure to get Lauma if you do want to play Nefer. I would say this is a fairly required thing. So that would be the first thing. Second is between C1 and R1. So my main preface would be numerically, if you don't have another 5-star weapon or a different alternative to the signature, and you're running like the base free-to-play weapon, you should go for C0R1. But if you do want to aim for more copies, it might be more valuable to get C2R0 rather than C1R1, or strictly just getting the weapon. So keep that in mind. The C2 is very, very strong, so going for the C2 rather than C1R1 could be more beneficial. So overall, I think the question of C1 or R1, I would probably give it to the weapon, but if you do plan on investing further, then I would say maybe go C2, then go R1, just because that C2 constellation is fucking crazy. So overall, she's a pretty strong character, definitely around Flynn's level right now, and I expect her to probably jump up even higher with the likes of Columbina, and maybe even future units coming in Cry to fill in that last gap slot. So overall, recommendations, I would say that if you didn't pull Lauma, you should skip. If you did and you do want her, then you should go ahead and get her. She is a pretty solid option, and she's probably going to get better with the future of Cry. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. This video took me a lot of time. I'm gonna go ahead and link my calculator I used in the description. This was made by me, so if you do have any problems with it, go ahead and comment on this video. If you have any like problems or notice anything wrong, go ahead and subscribe, like, and follow. Make sure you use my LootBar if you are topping up on Genesis crystals. A link is in the description. Thank you so much. Have fun in 6.1.